I guess. All right, great.
Okay, can I test if I'm audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, just give me a second, setting up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If the inherent issue of today's world is that discrimination occurs because of greed, that minorities are constantly discriminated and segregated, ostracized and alienated out of opportunities and benefits and privileges because they are segregated due to greed of those who are much more wealthier than them, then it must be the debate. It must then be the issue of today's debate that we must help those who have been abused by wealth and by greed of the people. But the issue with greed is that it does not then discriminate as to who holds greed. Everyone can become greed, even those who are entitled to benefiting from inherent diversity or affirmative actions of the past. This looks like those who are Malay in Malaysia who acquire Bumiputra rights, where a lot of poor Malays have actually been blocked out of opportunities and actual privileges because a lot of the rooms and a lot of the seats for scholarships or opportunities to work in high-paying government jobs are overtaken by those who are in wealthy positions, who can use their nepotism power, their inherent power that they've acquired over time due to the inherent diversity that they've acquired, to abuse it and to lock out the poor even further away from accessing these benefits, right? Before I move on, sure.
What demographic is likely the most to utilize nepotism?
Okay, the demographic that's most likely to use nepotism are those who are much more likely to be within places of power. But what this doesn't prevent is those who have previously been discriminated, maybe women, for example, who have acquired places of power, to not then use it for their own greed. But we've seen this way too many times. Sheikh Hasina is a person who is a woman, but have abused it and segregated other women from accessing benefits. Margaret Thatcher is a woman who was the Prime Minister of the UK, but is very popular or unpopular for being a misogynist, someone who have not let greed overtaken their conscience and push aside their actual principles to help those in need. We say that greed is something that does not discriminate as to who holds that power, right? Moving on then, what is the actual issue, right? We say that in today's world, there has been affirmative actions or policies, diversity policies that are inherent diversity in the past. And we've seen this through Bumiputra, and we've seen this through feminist or women affirmative actions, right? It has able to filter out and given the ability and capacity for minorities to rise up. However, it has also at the same time created loopholes for the wealthy to further abuse these privileges and create a bigger gap between the poor and the rich. We've come to a point in time where those who are most discriminated aren't the Malays anymore, and they're not just the Black people. It is those who have also been discriminated by other Black people. For example, that judge in the Supreme Court who is notorious for siding with white supremacists. For example, the Indians in Malaysia who are arguably the most discriminated, yet they are not given any privileges. It's because it prioritizes certain group of people without assessing whether this particular individual actually deserves this or not. It then becomes the principal obligation of the government to help those in most need, as opposed to those who simply fulfills the metrics as to what a person could possibly might need this, right? If you're a woman, you can get it. That's not completely fair, right? So then how is this going to work then? This is going to work by first assessing this individual person, whether or not they have gone through historical cycles of poverty, or they've gone through a wide array of structural issues. For example, they are disabled, so on and so forth. But then secondly, it is also accessing the entire background of this particular individual, the community that they grew up in, where they live, the particular geographical location of where they were raised. This means that if OP were to come in and say that we are unable to then fix the wrongs of the government, for the historical discrimination that they've practiced in the past towards minorities, we're still able to help minorities, because your community or the underdevelopment of a particular community that you are in, or the cycles of poverty that you are trapped in, are most likely caused by the wrongs of the government as well, like Jim Crow laws. This means that we are still helping those who are Black, we're still helping those who are Indians, and those and all the minorities, right? So then we better help these people, because it's a better targeted solution as opposed to a blanket policy that just simply helps those who fulfills the metric. First argument then, why is it that the inherent diversity has caused more harm? First is because this has allowed other people to abuse it, as I've already characterized it, right? Those who are in power are more likely than not to be overwhelmed by guilt, because then can continuously use the same metric again and again to help those specific individuals to then acquire that power. Secondly, is that it's not targeted. This means that you are more likely going to be picked for these policies because you fulfill a certain metric, i.e., you fulfill the characteristics of a woman and someone who is in the minority. But if you're a woman and a minority, for example, you're Black, African American woman, you might also live in the suburbs, which means that it is segregating and ostracizing those who are in further lockouts of privileges, right? Thirdly, is that it has created a space for nepotism to flourish, right? Because of the fulfillment of metrics, which can be overused time and time again, people can argue with the same characterization as and argue that as the reason why they deserve to be in this particular place, or to deserve to have this particular scholarship. What it doesn't explain to you is that whether or not it is assessing the entire community broadly, right? This means that if you were to give out blanket scholarships to everyone all over the place, right, you are not targeting those within the most underdeveloped communities, because those people within these communities are unlikely to get the same amount of privileges of education, and better ways to present themselves in terms of literature and writing towards in comparison to people who live in big cities, right? This means that inherently the ability and the capacity for them to present themselves much more worthy of a scholarship when you are applying scholarships, writing for scholarships, then is dwindled down because you are not someone from the big city with already existing privileges, right? Those within communities, or like these communities like the projects or the ghettos, are those who much more likely are in need. So then how is it that we are exclusively and uniquely able to solve this? Firstly, it's because by assessing the individual and the entire community, we take into consideration the geographical location of this particular person, which means that the government is obligated and incentivized to care more on the development of an entire community as opposed to one particular individual that fulfills this diversity quota, right? This means that they're more likely to give a fuck about giving more scholarships to more people in the projects, as opposed to giving one person in the project a chance, and then like three very incredibly smart people in the big city a chance to get scholarships. This means that the incentive for you to give more scholarships to people in the projects means that in the long term, you're able to help that community go out and upskill out of that cycles of poverty for other people as well. Something that is only uniquely achieved when it's an acquired diversity, something that takes into consideration not only your merits and your characteristics, but in the entirety of your community and who you were surrounded with. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the leader of opposition. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear and see me?
You're audible, but it's kind of soft. Is it possible to speak closer to the mic?
Okay, let me see what I can do. Because Zoom just updated and then I'm like very unfamiliar now. Okay, is this better? Does this do anything?
Yep, it's somewhat better. You're audible.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start with some meta commentary. I think this debate is more about the principle of distribution as opposed to the practical outcomes of distribution. And the reason for this is because PM themselves explicitly conceded that there's going to be a strong overlap on both sides. So it's likely the case that if you are a minority population with your distinct race and culture, you likely live in a place far away, and therefore you would qualify under both kind of diversity attributes, like affirmative actions. If it's the case that you're Black, then you're also like more likely to be poor, for example, statistically, and therefore the quantification of that is quite nil. So I think the delta of the debate lies elsewhere in the principal way by which we should decide to band people together to help them collectivize and to increase the propensity for them to be able to access affirmative action. I think that is something that we will exclusively do on opening opposition. My contribution here will be threefold. The first is I explain to you why is it the case that we get more affirmative actions. The second is I explain to you why is it the case that the affirmative actions that we get are exclusive in need and that there are already existing structures that then help the people on their side of the house. The last is going to explain to you why it's the case that the people on outside need these affirmative actions more. Firstly, on why is it the case that we get more affirmative actions? I think this debate is partly about fundamentally choosing the way by which people ought to see themselves and collectivize to like lobby for affirmative actions and there's like adjacent policies. So OG's principal issue with this with the current model is wealth, i.e., if it's the case that you are rich as of the moment, maybe you do not require the affirmative actions. But I'd like to flip this claim and argue that it's likely to be a good thing. And the reason for that is because this is an active capital that you then give to the movement or to the group here that is trying to get affirmative action for themselves. Because on the comparative, it is the case that you are only categorizing people based on acquired attributes. Your disabled entities and individuals are going to be lost among the people who are poor. But if it's the case then that a rich individual who happens to be disabled see themselves in the image of other people who are at need here, it's on outside the house that we encourage these people to come out to lobby. I think this is then worth a trade-off. Maybe it's the case that Stephen Hawking maybe get like a scholarship to go wherever because of the fact that he is disabled, but not accounting for his needs. But that's still fine because of the fact that we help people to collectivize a bit better. So outside the house, people collectivize among the inherent attributes, but they get resources from the spread of acquired attributes as well. So if it's the case that you're fighting for feminism and you want to have like women's quota in the corporate workplace or in parliament, it's likely to be the case on outside the house. That movement get more rich women who can then better get the message out there and campaign for more policies. Before I go on, I'll take one from closing.
Yeah, so on a principle level, do you think the poor white man deserves education less than the rich black man?
I don't think the debate is as clean as that. And even if it's the case that like this is where the delta is, the debate on Gulf's delta is only in the small chances where people who might have been able to afford things for themselves get these things. I'm not quite sure why that is better as compared to an outside house where we are able to fundamentally prove to you that because of the fact that rich people see themselves in the minority demographics, they fund these initiatives better, they put more money into lobbying and therefore they expand the pie, getting more affirmative actions for a broader group of people. So even if it's the case that like I give you your POI, I think on net we're able to prove utilitarianism. The second thing I want to talk about now is, I think more important also, is exclusivity. I think that just generally structural accommodations for people with acquired diversity to fight back against prejudice. If you look at poor people, individually, they can be considered people who are disenfranchised. But collectively, they are a massive political group with immense political capital, which is why oftentimes political parties from around the world panders to people who are like the average man or the poor. If you talk about people who speak the same language or share the same background or come from the same place, these are people with strong geopolitical capital because they likely have a representative that can stand for themselves. I want to note that it's likely to be the case that inherent attributes do not grant people the same capacity for empowerment. And if it's the case that it does, then it does so uniquely through acquired attributes already. For example, if it's the case that you happen to be black, then perhaps you live in the same area and therefore the same mechanisms apply on both sides of the house. But what about people who don't live with the community? Or what about the people whose community are so small that they can never collectivize in the very first place? We're talking about people who are disabled, for example. We're talking about people with unique kind of illnesses. On outside the house, I think these people require more help because they cannot campaign, for example, or like lobby, for example, for their own representative, or they cannot lobby for politicians by giving them votes because it's just structurally less collectivized and wielding less political power in nature. So what that means is that for the people who are then more marginalized in these instances, it's important for us to cater our specific affirmative actions to cater to their needs because it's only then that they get the fringe delta that they need in order to be able to qualify for opportunities. And this is important because affirmative actions don't fundamentally change the conditions of these communities by themselves. It's likely to be the case that legislative change is important and it happens on both sides of the house. Our point is that it's likely to be the case that individuals bounded by inherent attributes are more likely to be splintered and not able to collectivize. Therefore, they need to be able to tap into affirmative actions because it's the only thing that they have at their disposal. For poor people who are able to band together, who are able to collectivize and vote for individuals so they can stand for the capacity to better their conditions, etc., I think affirmative actions matter less because they have other avenues of empowerment that are not then accessible to other individuals. Before I go on, I'll take opening for any clarification. 5, 4.
Sorry. Yes. So how does this then help those who are already, how does this then help those who are not privileged and don't have any other avenues of getting scholarships other than the government, because companies won't prioritize them because they are not naturally privileged?
So at worst, I think we do give money to the rich white, to the rich woman who arguably could have been able to get into university and pay for her own education. But the point here is not just about that. It's about the fact that we are able to get people to lobby for the policy. And additionally, it's about the fact that if it's the case that you are poor, there's still other avenues of empowerment. You need to talk about the comparative. The last thing I want to talk about now is that prejudice against inherent attributes are likely stronger and more harmful than prejudice against acquired attributes. And the reason for this is because it's structural in nature. It's about the fact that these things don't constitute who you are. You can change places, you can speak a different language, you can become richer, and then you can change all the attributes associated with you. But if you're black or you're woman, you're forever these things. I think it's actually quite presumptuous for us to think that these considerations and the prejudice inflicted upon you by these characters are less important than the conditions imposed upon you by socioeconomic status. It's unclear which one is more harmful. Insofar as that's true, I think it's more likely to be the case that if people cannot fundamentally change their protected attribute, they cannot fundamentally opt out of those things. Therefore, they require more assistance because of the fact that there's just lesser capacity for opt out, and you're just more prejudiced against. For all these reasons, we start with opening opposition.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the DPM. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Let me rearrange my notes real quick. All right. I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So right now, right, just to recap what the real issue is, status quo is, right? The first things first, we have to really conceptualize this, right? Because the goal of diversity, which is the whole theme of this debate, is to support the people at the bottom who most need it in the present, not necessarily historically, right? And acquired diversity aims to fulfill the individual needs and individual communities, as said by my first speaker. And the inherent diversity is important also, but when it causes loopholes that the wealthy or any kind of privileged group can abuse, that's where we should change the solution, because things like this does not account fully for backgrounds such as locations, economic stability, and instability and opportunities that are available to these people in these communities, right? So thus it helps poor communities, thus has more ability to upscale the places of their community in the first place. So this, if we look at the problems, right, in the today's debate, so what does this look like? It looks like no one else will help these minorities, right? In terms company scholarships, where they are more incentivized money, how much money this person can get them, right? And they are likely to prioritize already privileged people, right? And another thing is that government is the only one that can help them, because they're incentive is not money. Government is not incentivized by money. Government is not for profit, as I said. So even if Ops says that they are incentivized by the people that can help lobby, they achieve this better by creating more support of a committee to the government by helping more people on the ground, right? So if we look at the principles that were given by the opposition, right? So they talk about the principle of how they're going to help each other and so on and so forth, right? But it's our principle is better because it solves the best, because the principal obligation isn't to help, but actually help those in most need. Because if you think about it, these kind of people who are poor and so on and so forth, right? Those are the people who are really needing it. So recapping our main points after recontextualizing the problems here, right? So the main points given by first speaker is that first things first, discrimination occurs out of greed, and greed does not discriminate on those in power, right? So if you're greedy, it doesn't matter. Everybody is greedy, but people who have power and are greedy are the most dangerous, right? So you can see in this example where my first speaker talked about how discriminated people can also discriminate against other people, discrimination, right? Which means it actually kind of defeats the purpose of what Op is saying, that but these people, for example, people of disability will also help other people with disability, when in some cases people with disability are the ones who are discriminating against other people with disability, right? And another thing that I would like to recap is like better targeted solutions. Our solution is as better than like an effective blanket solution, which is like the opposition is fighting for, right? And like blanket solutions are ineffective to target specific communities. So if you think about it, right, it helps like government to incentivize to like improve and prove the disadvantage and systematically discriminate communities, because now that thing is like accounted for in things like, for example, government scholarships and so on and so forth, right? So like why our solution solves it best, right? Because first is first, the role of the government, right, is not to help those that don't need help, but to help those who really need it the most. And like with this solution, which we are fighting for, we are basically focusing on like individual based and individual committee. And we think about it, like individual based like problems, right, is also affected by historical discrimination, which like the op brings up like, oh, historically discriminated. Yes, individuals are also affected by historical discrimination. So in our case, we actually don't neglect historical discrimination. In fact, we find it as just as important, right? So like one way to like how to fix this historical discrimination is also like to help minorities, because if you think about the policies that we currently have, right, like for example like the inherent affirmative action policies, right, these policies, as you can see in status quo, are not effective because they are not prioritized. And like these people can actually like, poor people, not only that, okay, it's true, they say like on their side, their community can also help the other people in their community, but on our side we can say the same, because poor people will also help poor people. Not only will they help themselves through this like affirmative action, but also they help people of poor community, because like these people also live with them in those kind of communities. Like in these places, all the people in those places are tend to be poor at the same time, right? They are closer together as you expect, right? So in that case, meaning they were more incentivized to like help each other and so on and so forth, right? So another thing that they talk about is like lobbying as like a solution, right? Because they say, oh, it's going to help them and so on and so forth, because it's like more affirmative through collective incentives, right? Through class groups. But we say like this is not necessarily true, because even if it happens, right, it only happens in a small majority, because in small minority, because think about it, the people who want to lobby are the people who really really care about the community, right? The rich people who are really 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 care about the community that much, even if they care, right, they're usually going to help other people who are wealthy, not necessarily people who are like exactly like poor and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really help the people who need it the most, which is like a thing that happens is at the school, which you can see like lobbying in America, where rich people are the ones who like actually benefit from lobbying and so on and so forth, right? And like another thing why the solution does not work, right? Because like the principle of history is right. It's just that we in our solution, we also co-opt that principle while also solving current issues like systematic poverty due to other factors as well. So like they on another responses to like OO as given by the op, right? They talk about like exclusivity on their side, which we already say is not true. And they talk about inherent diversity are more inherently able to work together, which is also not true. So in the end, right, if you think about it, Gov does not it does not fulfill the principle of being feminist if it is still actively discriminating the women in the projects that desperately need them more. Because these people, they alternatively resort to things like violence, right? Wealthy people, if they don't get like advantages, they can still opt to other things. They have options. But people who are poor, what is the alternative? The alternative is like violence, right? Or like locked in a dead end job with little no pay. They literally have no option. So when we give them an option, right, they can actually pull themselves out and actually help other people like them, because they have the experience that those people also went through, right? And to sum it up, because like no one else looks at them, because this literally monetary benefits to be gained. These people don't come from big families and have strong connections. So the government is the only one who have the incentive and will incentivize to actually develop this kind of things. So with that, I would like to end my speech. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the DLO. Here.
Yeah.
Oh,
Can you check
it's
them visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. two things in my speech. First, why is it that it's better to prioritize the ability for the most vulnerable individuals to get help based on their inherent attributes? Second, why is it that these inherent attributes in and of themselves are usually harder to overcome anyway, and that's the reason why we need to prioritize them. But first, why is it that when we prioritize the ability for more vulnerable individuals to get help based on inherent abilities, we get usually better change than on their side of the house? The first thing is to note is again that it's quite likely that vulnerable individuals are intersectionally vulnerable. So what this means is that as it's considered as by both sides, it's probably likely for a black individual to also be poor. So what now makes the difference in this debate is whether or not you should be giving the scholarship based on the fact that they're a black person, or based on the fact and therefore potentially helping certain wealthier black individuals, or should you give this based on the fact that this person is also poor. So what I think OG tried to explain is that apparently it's extremely difficult for you to get out of your situation as a poor person. We think that this is broadly true, but the reason why you need to you definitely need to give it to someone as a black person is because it's far harder for you to collectivize based on these minority identities as opposed to the class identity, right? So there's a reason why there's a reason why it's very hard for example, most governments to demonize the poor, to say that all poor people are criminals, and stuff, and rhetoric like this. The reason is because they have fairly large demographic and have fairly high voting power, right? And oftentimes they are the people who actually decide the elections. That's the reason why, for example, there's a lot of reasons for governments to already have welfare policies to help poorer individuals, for example. Or there's a lot of reasons why governments tend to give unemployment benefits and whatnot. Precisely because this is a large demographic of people who would benefit from it, and therefore they have a lot of political power already. And it's very easy for them to collectivize based on class. It's precisely because so many people are affected by it, and therefore it naturally becomes for example, part of discourse. It naturally becomes something that politicians care about. The difference then is that it's easy for these people to collectivize, and they would do it anyway. But for minorities, it's often a lot harder for them to collectivize, and or if they do collectivize via class, they precisely because they're so few in numbers, often just get lost in the crowd, right? So for example, someone who is disabled or someone who is a black minority might be part of the general class of poor people, but they don't get their specific needs highlighted in the ways that they oftentimes need. The fact that they face structural racism that expedites their inability to access proper employment, let's say. It's precisely because not the problems within that these people face are often not caused only by this poverty, only by the problems of poverty, of social economic barriers. They're oftentimes active barriers of racial problems, or racism that and discrimination that that specifically puts them in these situations. And that's the reason why that you need to highlight this problem via affirmative action, and therefore remove them from poverty via this particular way, and highlight that this is actually the problem in society. But more importantly, the problem when they get lost in the crowd in the vast majority of instances where they collectivize via class is that you're unable to actually target the problem. So sure, this poor disabled person might receive money as compensations because you're doing this as a class-based thing to get them to university, but there's no highlighting of the fact that they got in based on their disability, which for example might mean that they get less accommodations for those disabilities. They might not, for example, have the unique infrastructure that they require in order for them to attend class or whatever not. For individuals who get into university, precisely because it's based on this class attribute as opposed to their disabled attribute. So that's the reason why it's very important for you to highlight this minority attributes, precisely because those are the specific and unique things that make their life difficult as compared to other things. But the second thing, the second part of my speech will be on explaining why is it that these inherent attributes are just far harder to overcome as compared to the stuff that they highlighted class or geographical location, right? We think that this is fairly intuitive. It's just that even if you're a richer individual who has this protected attribute, who has this inherent attribute, it's far more likely that you're also still very affected by it. It's not as if rich disabled people can walk. They are still bound to their wheelchair, for example. They are still bound to locations that don't they have sufficient infrastructure for their needs. So it might be true that they might have some better accommodations, they, for example, might have a better wheelchair, or which is better than no wheelchair at all, but they are still similarly affected, and therefore we think that they like still deserve help as much as like these poor individuals on their comparative might claim to have. So the reason why then it's extremely important for this particular like disability to be highlighted, or like this particular like attribute to be highlighted, is precisely because it's not something that you can change, right? Like even if you put a black person in a, like if you take this black person out of this specific geographical location where they were born in and put them somewhere else, they'll still be similarly discriminated against by racism. Like this like structural barriers and racism and or like this ableism applies regardless of where you are, and we think that like that's a far more important issue to highlight and prioritize in order to reduce those structural barriers for them, as opposed to like just having a broad-based issue, like broad-based thing based on
Before 6.
Your class. But yeah, sure, before 6.
Wouldn't it be easier to prove the results for a scholarship training program that targets changeable attributes rather than unchangeable ones?
Okay, sure, you can potentially like have more people who for example uplifted out of poverty, but what you lose out then and therefore trade off is your ability to, for example, like have people who say that I got into college due to this affirmative action, and therefore like collectivize like and fight for better policies for like black individuals, for example. So even though you might say that like you have like on paper a better percentage of like we have more people lifted out of poverty, in reality you like not all of those people like get uplifted out of poverty because you reduce their structural barriers. Like you reduce the ability for these very specific like individuals who have that attribute to collectivize and fight for more policies because of it, and we think that that's a unique harm on their side of the house. Very proud to be OO.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now to start off closing half, I now call upon member of Gov. Here.
Hey, thanks. Just let me sort through my notes for a second. Okay. Okay. I prefer my PLIs in the chat. Please don't interrupt my speech, and I'll probably take around 5 if that's possible. With that, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think both sides realistically want to be able to help the ones who deserve the help, or who want to be able to break down certain structural barriers that are impeding on a person's ability, especially the marginalized and vulnerable people, onto like their ability to be able to create a life for themselves and to be able to actualize certain realities for themselves at the end of the day. But I think the way that OO goes, like the way they do it is very weird in a certain way, because the first thing that they say is that identity markers are good because it allows groups to be able to band together more like cohesively, I think, in certain ways, especially when you're able to include like rich people who are part of that minority, because you're able to have more resources, right? But I'm really unclear as to why this happens at the end of the day. But even so, I will still posit that those who are more vulnerable under a certain racial group, for example, are more likely to already have an incentive to already collectivize in the first place, and is much more effective in and of itself. I will also argue there's already happening in status quo, and is why it's so important, right? Because they're able to relate on experience, they're able to relate on how like working through the treatment that they get from society. But yeah, also I'm unsure why like targeting changeable traits is suddenly going to be very like less effective compared to talking unchangeable traits. I think my extension, how I'm going to differentiate from OG is precisely that I'm going to talk about how like through this policy we're able to actually challenge certain structural barriers through the like idea of perception that can translate into physical like physical things that we see in real life, for example, like state funding, or even corporate funding for like diversity training, for example, right? Because the extension here I want to posit is that about identity politics, and that in the status quo, a lot of politicians like to play the race game or like ethnic game, which I think both sides agree. They want to pander to populist narratives to create more urgency within their own community to become like voters, and they do this by like putting down certain groups of people. They want to enforce stereotypes. They want to normalize racism and microaggressions. They want to normalize xenophobia. But then the problem then becomes that whatever help or affirmative action that the government is providing in the status quo already right now is flawed in three ways. First of all, is quite limited. Secondly, it receives a lot of criticism from people like far-right conservatives who are arguing to take it down because, like, oh, people don't need it. Oh, a lot of Black people don't need it. A lot of Hispanic people don't need it because they're able to pull up by the bootstraps, and then they're able to make a life for themselves in this current capitalist system. But thirdly, and that the problem also becomes that a lot of these systems are very simply done in a way that's not emphasized to the extent that it should be emphasized. Meaning that the system within this and the mechanisms within this is very flawed or very like unspecific or very like blanket kind of policy that applies to like a vaguely large group of people when it should be really applying to the ones who are most vulnerable in today's society, because it's what policy was created in the first place for. And because of this, as like affirmative action or like diversity policies in general have received a lot of flack about, diversity policies are useless. Diversity policies don't really help the poor or the vulnerable. Or even so, you will argue that, the poor and vulnerable are not really existing in the first place, or that they're a minority and that we shouldn't take care of them in the first place, right? Because I will argue then the way that this policy works under the government allows for certain things. Because when you're able to target people, when you're able to like give them some like these benefits based on their lived experiences in today's society, in a different country, for example, you're then able to change the perception of like, firstly, people or political parties in general, and secondly, in corporate. Because firstly, what you do and achieve under CG at least is different from like OG when they talk about, we should help the poor and stuff like that. They don't really link it as to why they're able to do that. Is firstly, you're able to get more state funding into like the poor and solving poverty in the first place. I'll take you later. Why? Because then when you're able to see that all these minorities who are being given benefits because they're able to work hard or they have certain characteristics that show that they deserve this because they have potential to be able to succeed in life largely, they're then able to see more success coming out from these minority groups. You're then more able to see that these minority groups do have a lot of unique potential that's being overlooked by today's society because of the way affirmative action, for example, is being treated in today's society. Because then what you create is that it becomes more politically popular to want to be the party or to want to be the one who is able to help the most poor people, who is able to widen avenues for the most disadvantaged and marginalized people. But secondly, in a corporate world, when these people are able to achieve success, when these people are able to provide like reports that they're doing really well quarterly, or that they're getting more consumers, they're attracting more people, they're attracting more investment from investors, they're able to attract more confidence from people to invest in their own company, for example, the higher ups and superiors, CEOs, CFOs, whatever, are then also more willing to want to invest in things like diversity training, or also more likely want to seek out talent that are more like diverse and inclusive in the first place, right? Because they see that their perception is a little bit wrong in a certain way when they see like, all these minorities are actually really like talented people. They're actually the same as everyone else, because they see that providing providing funding for diversity policies to those acquired diversity brings in very big in returns to the company, brings in a lot of benefits to the company that they otherwise would not have achieved in the first place, right? Which means on the two metric that I want to weigh on, first, severity, we're not only able to like help vulnerable people and trapped in the poverty cycle to be able to break out and then be able to, make a life for themselves, to support themselves and their own family. But secondly, on severity, we're also able to change certain perceptions of certain groups of people towards like a certain racial group, a certain ethnic group, a certain disabled group. That these people deserve to be seen as people who are also on par with the rest of society as a whole, or might even like have a lot of skilled talent within these communities. But secondly, on irreversibility, when you're able to transfer push more state funding and push more corporate funding, you also create a more normalized society where it is it is seen as a good thing, or it's seen as a very effective thing when you pour money into helping marginalized communities, when you pour money into being able to help certain groups, or like people who are like certain groups of people who are poor, right? Which means that at the end of the day, you're able to get more gradual and irreversible change that is good and progressive under CG. With that, proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the member of Op here.
Hi, checking if I'm audible.
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay. Verbal POIs. There's three main portions towards the speech then. Firstly, in terms of two main clarifications to deal with the opening half. Secondly, in terms of the deadlock that was left unsolved by closing government, as well as unsolved in the opening half. And lastly, then, in terms of three last extensions in weighing terms over opening opposition. Onto the two clarifications then. Firstly, government bench cannot fall back their entire case line on is a rich person against an extremely poor white person. And I'll explain this simply because, number one, let's look at the demographics in terms of who actually goes towards what sort of scholarships. Because I think in this round, and the fatal flaw coming from every single team in this round so far, is that they run all of this as a monolith in the first place. We think that those rich Black people, for example, what they're likely to go for is probably just financial aid in the Ivy Leagues in the first place, because they probably, and running by government bench's best case scenario, they already have the really good education. Therefore, they are unlikely to rob the opportunities of, for example, a poor white person in the first place, or they're unlikely to rob the opportunities of a poor Black person that their side would later on want to fight for in on their later on speeches. Therefore, we think we already minimize the harm in most cases then. But I also still want to note that even if you do not buy this, that this is going to be a large minority in the first place, if they also concede towards the fact that these people, and as the analysis goes, intuitively, these people are the ones that are minorities in society by numbers themselves. They are minorities by the fact they are likely isolated by society. They live in certain neighborhoods. They live in certain communities, such as Chinatown or the streets of New Orleans. In all of these examples, these individuals have been isolated from the rest of society and likely suffer from the worst perceptions at the end of the day just because of their inherent diversity. Even if they're rich and even if they do not have this sort of acquired diversity, we still think at the end of the day, their inherent diversity was the reason why you needed to actually help these people. The second is in terms of what do these policies actually encompass. So I want to firstly deal with this and sort out the burdens here. Number one, on closing opposition, we're going to solve why we actually go back to the core intentions of diversity policies and the actual goals of these diversity policies. And secondly, we're going to also tell you why government bench actually erodes this entire concept in the first place. Moving on to the deadlock breaker then, I want to note how a mess opening half was, because it was simply just a back and forth of the Black person at the top will not help the Black person at the bottom. And opening government says that the poor person at the top would actually help those people in the first place. And I think this was extremely wishy-washy and a soft case line for them in the first place. The reason that we got from opening government here is that these individuals have their own close personal ties due to proximity, that this person lived in the same neighborhood as you. But I don't think that's a strong enough incentive for you to actually help them, because at the end of the day, if their entire speech was 3 minutes of just these individuals have greed, I do not understand why this greed still applies to these same individuals who still got to the top, because they think themselves that I worked so hard and I got to the top. Therefore, now they are going to go along the same lines as the greed OG talks about in their own speeches. For that exact reason, then this is why those poor people won't help them on their side of the house. Even if some rich Black person won't help people on our side of the house, the benefit that we do get and that OO does not claim is that these people, number one, it's not just awareness, but it's also the fact that you disestablish these stereotypes that have been put against these people, that Black people can actually be in these civilized institutions, for example. They can be in the Ivy Leagues, for example, and all of these institutions where they had inherently been left out on. And this actually combats the conservative white narratives that CG wants to talk about in this case. And I want to deal with the last extension coming from CG then right after this, because what CG claims here is that these individuals are likely going to be viewed as the fact that they did work hard to actually get in this place. But I want to note that this comes from a reason racist individual's perspective in the first place. And the only reason they were fighting for poor people was because they saw a poor white person. Therefore, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, when a poor black person succeeds on their side of the house, they're still going to go back to the same narrative that they only got help because they're a minority, and they're going to diminish all of their same accomplishments at the end of the day. Therefore, CG does not actually help individuals on the ground. Last three extension said, but before that, any POIs?
Yep. I want to know what is the direct outcome of platforming a black man in your side.
Yeah, I'll deal with that in my extensions here. First extension then, in which side generates more structural change, and with 3 layers are to respond directly to that POI. The upfront weighing over opening here is that the extent of OO is that they can collectivize and lobby, and they say these poor people are going to be better on government bench. I'm going to deal with on our side of the house why actually these, like, the poor people, why we, inherent diversity people on our side of the house are going to be better off. 3 points said. Number 1, we are able to acquire better workplace policies. Why was this true specifically? Because if you are a black person in a company, you likely will also want to get the same actual treatment for a good, like, black people in a company. Why a woman at the top of the ladder, for example, even if she just individually girl boss her way up there, it was still going to be more beneficial because the policies also directly affect them. If you're a poor white person who got to the top, you have no reason to actually to create policies that, oh, you should not discriminate against poor people, because I don't think that necessarily happens in a workplace. You have discrimination against women in the workplace, and if your boss is a woman, that actually got in because of inherent diversity policies, this is when this woman is actually going to enact these policies to actually protect women in the workplace, ones that are going to help them against sexual harassment, ones that actually tell HR to actually deal with these problems in the first place and prevent things such as racism or discrimination against religions, actually providing like proper like procedures for people who are religious and want to have their religious prayers, for example. But it also looks in terms of wage gaps, which are extremely important, and we therefore also take on the point of financial benefit here, because these individuals are able to financially benefit as a woman and break these perceptions. These perceptions are important to break because this also means that we can tear down the entire structural issue coming from that inherent diversity. But secondly, political campaigning is much going to be better on our side of the house for a few reasons. In terms of what does CO uniquely give you here, CEO is going to tell you here that individuals are actually able to get these better political campaigning issues, because if government bench wants to say that the people at the top will always be those rich people, at the end of the day, the people now are going to be on our side of the house that actually lobby for these in the first place. Government bench also runs along the same analysis that nepotism or people that simply just have connections are able to get better policies for them. And similarly, the black person at the top, even if they've already been rich, they are going to get lobby for the same things at the end of the day. The weighing is simple. Our top-down change is much more stable, and secondly, it's much more long-lasting because it can't be drowned out when fights for these individuals' rights simply just stop or simply just come to a halt or slow down in any chance. But the second extension here is in terms of which side proliferates abuse of policy. It is simple here because individuals simply just fake documents, and that already happens in the status quo. For example, if your parents own a business, you can fake their documents. Therefore, the harm is you actually have more individuals that don't actually get the scholarships for themselves. You can't actually fake your race. You can't fake a physical disability. If you say you simply can't walk, that's just simply like more impossible to actually fake. And we tell them more people on our side of the house actually on CO uniquely get this benefit. With all those reasons opposed.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I invite the Gov with Kiki.
All right. You guys in the chat. The goal of affirmative action is to help uplift minorities, and thus the metrics on how best we allocate limited resources ought to be when most help is done. And I think I understand it's not as simple as a rich black woman against the poor white man. But across the differing traits that affect your chances and the intersectionality of identity, the focus is on changeable factors over unchangeable ones, and we explain why prioritizing that was likely to lead to a greater outcome. CG shows that prioritizing the acquired attribute of affirmative action shifts the focus towards attributes that are changeable, which increases the focus and resources towards improving those attributes, creating the greatest degree of impact. CG goes further to show that because of the way resources for training programs are allocated, it is much better for us to prioritize greater outcomes, because this increases the capital that's allocated for this affirmative action program, be it scholarships or training programs to diversity quotas, whatever, increasing the scale of affirmative action overall. The reason behind this, as explained in the member, that doesn't get much response, is that states need results to show that programs are effective in order to gain social support, to get political capital, and to allocate tax funds towards programs like this. If your program targets a very specific minority, you don't get the same kind of capital, your local municipal council is unlikely to pass policies or programs on this scale. But even if you don't look at governments, corporations need to show results to justify and continue investing in the profits into CSR projects. This is potentially profitable in the long-term upskilling as well, the same way corporations invest in developing their employees. But the point here is that if you focus on changeable attributes, like focusing on teaching English, for example, or focusing on upskilling yourself, you can earn a higher income. Corporations and governments can say that these programs were really, really effective, and they can use this data and impact analysis to argue for more of these such programs, to argue for more resources and funding for these things. You need to have the data on impact investments, focusing on changeable attributes, and actually changing those attributes, which is much more likely to create that outcome. How does this weigh against opening government? Opening government looks at privileged minorities exploiting the system for their own advantage. We think this is absolutely true, but OG doesn't prove a positive outcome on net. So while it's focusing on changeable attributes or acquired diversity may make it harder for people to exploit the system, CG goes much, much further in showing how norms in societies shift. Because when the entire metrics are focusing on affirmative actions, now looking at your English standard or looking at your geographical background, the things that you can change, which people have an incentive to change their systems where they can, but also structures in society are more likely to shift as well to help those people change. This shows a greater outcome on scale. This means that we also show why more minorities are helped more under this policy, which incidentally also wins the clash against opening opposition, which is another reason why we beat opening gov. How then does this weigh against opposition bench? Let's first talk about closing opposition. The first thing they say is that it's necessary for us to focus on the kind of inherent traits. It's because you want to break stereotyping by platforming a black man. My question in the POI is, what is the outcome of platforming this particular black person? Does it serve as an inspiration for other black children to perhaps study a bit harder? Does it serve as I don't know, really. So how exactly you get that outcome and why that outcome is beneficial is unproven in closing opposition at this point in the debate. The second thing you said in CO is that you get more workplace policies. How exactly you get these policies and the process of lobbying for that change is deeply unclear in closing opposition. And I think, again, these to be compared to the kind of policies that you get in closing government as well, because they don't prove the likelihood of success. And because the argument on focusing on specific groups like CO says religious people, OO says disabled people, is not necessarily distinct from OO, and I will deal with that later. The last thing they say in the dying minutes of the member is that people fake disability. I'm not sure how exactly they do it, and if they do it in Gov, we don't support that. We're very happy to punish and name and shame them. This brings us then to opening opposition. Opening opposition's case broadly centers around the collectivization of minorities around these specific identity groups. They say there are three things that this is good, two reasons why this is good. The first is that you can tap on resources from richer members, for example, rich white women. And the second is that these other specific groups cannot collectivize to ask for specific policies that they need. Let's first talk about collectivizing around identity markers. The crux of this claim is to say that the richer and the more privileged members in these movements are more likely to commit their resources, and thus you can gain the benefits of their wealth. This assumes that you can get a significant amount of resources from richer members of these movements. Opening up doesn't really prove the incentive for the rich white women to donate all their money to feminism, for example. So I'm not exactly sure how much resources they're going to get. I would suggest that this tends to not be the case, as richer people like to hoard wealth. They only donate tokenistic amounts and only to organizations that they care about. They often do it for publicity purposes and not for the actual meaningful impacts. Because as long as rich people can use their wealth to protect their own interests, they're unlikely to want to use this wealth to spread it beyond their immediate circle. I think just generally wanting to live a life of luxury is big enough of an incentive. Even if that's not the case, I think comparatively closing government gets much more resources, because the best case of the op bench relies on these rich members donating towards the movement. Our side is able to mobilize corporate and state capital to help support all these kinds of training programs, which means we get comparatively much more resources to support all the kind of programs that we want to talk about. Maybe we don't help specific minority, but we help more people overall. That's still a win for our side. Second, they say that specific groups cannot collectivize to ask for specific policies that they really need. For example, unique infrastructure for disabled people, or in CO's case, it's specific allocation or privileges for religious minorities. Before I rebut this, actually, is there anything from opening up? If not, I'll take closing.
So we claim that people closer to the top or those that actually have to deal with the workplace themselves are likely going to actually get these workplace policies. Why would they further work in a workplace where they're no longer going to be protected if they are always faced with discrimination?
Why would they work in a workplace where they face discrimination? I think they probably wouldn't. I'm sorry, I don't get the point of this PI. Let's go back to this. So in terms of asking for specific policies, the first thing we'll say is that you need to be realistic about how much support you can actually get. All movements are competing for political capital, and by virtue of you being a minority by the other side's admission, it can be quite difficult to get the policy outcomes that you want. But even if you could, focusing on acquired attributes, for example, poverty and language, can also provide pathways for disabled people to go up. So if you get better access to education because there are more scholarship in our side of the house, your life still improves, even if you don't have wheelchair ramps that go to the supermarket. And if you get rich enough, you can eventually buy your own mobilizing wheelchair or stuff to help you. In the worst case where we have to trade this off, we argue that movements achieve policy outcomes through iterative lobbying. We have to prioritize lower hanging fruit, even if it comes at the cost of the unique policy that those specific groups need. But the last thing we'll do is to flip this by showing that focusing on specific identity markers makes things much, much worse because it creates a lot of polarization in the society because the general population cannot empathize with your lived experiences there. Like moderate Christians that don't oppose discrimination, polarization makes things much worse and reduces the chance of you achieving your outcomes. For all those reasons, we're very happy to do this.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and I'll invite the op with Pia here.
Just give me a second to compile my notes. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, a second. Oh my gosh, I'm lagging. Sorry, give me a second. I think we need to expand this debate beyond just the elite institutions of the world, beyond just the fact that, companies can have training programs, or the fact that, the rich people are going to get more jobs or more opportunities in these places. Because this debate was about the grassroots, the ability for these individuals to even access levels of education that were unable to before. So it wasn't about the Oxfords or the Cambridges, like Opening Government tries to phrase it as, right, where there's limited spots and only the richest of the Black women can opt into them. It was about the Sunways or the Taylor's universities of the world, wherein these people who weren't able to access these institutions before are now given the ability to, as a result of things like historical reparations, or because of the fact that they had to suffer through more in life to get to the same point as, for example, a poor Bumiputra man. These people still should be given is priority. I'm going to do three things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to take down this entire case from Opening Government, and in the same vein, then take down some of the accusations from Closing Gov about how the richest are always going to be the most privileged on our side of the house. Secondly, I'm going to weigh how we are able to neutralize the entirety of CG case and then weigh over it. And lastly, I'm going to prove how we weigh over opening opposition then. Firstly, on Opening Government, the crux of the case is twofold. The first thing they say is that opportunities are only taken by those in the wealthiest places, and therefore, on opposition side, these positions are only taken by those in the wealthiest places, and therefore, it's fundamentally defunct. Right. Look at the three responses to this. Firstly, look at their phrasing here, right? Because all the examples they tell you is that the poorest of the Bumiputras aren't going to get a chance in university. Here's where the rhetoric falls and actually reveals all the holes in their case. Because on their side of the house, it was the poorest members of the Bumiputra community that were still going to be able to access this education over other races because of arbitrary factors, things like their language status, things like the fact that, for example, Malay is their first language. And what this means is, on their side of the house, they ignore those minorities that were disabled from opting into these universities in the first place. That is to say, the poor Malay man has fundamentally more opportunities because they're viewed more favorably in their community, or because their family simply has more roots. So, for example, are able to do things like access apprenticeships with more ease, or access vocational education or a diploma. This person is placed on the same pedestal as the Chinese woman born in the same community that has experienced discrimination and isolation from a very young age, that has worked extremely hard to get to that point. This was fundamentally incorrect. The point at which affirmative action acted as things like historical reparations for those that have suffered more. The fact that the Bumiputra man is almost always going to be able to opt into any middle-ranking university that has a quota for them, or the white man will always have an advantage in university interviews because they speak more formal compared to other racial minorities, means that on their side of the house, these scholarships didn't actually serve who they were meant to serve, the point at which they were still able to access many more opportunities compared to these people who face structural barriers. There was always more mobility for you as a majority, and that was why on their side of the house, the principle of the scholarship itself was defunct. On their side of the house, you fundamentally threw away any policy of reparation that you were meant to have, the point at which you decided to prioritize, the point at which you decided to deprioritize and ignore these structural barriers. But secondly, don't let closing government get away with strawmanning what we told you in Alicia's speech, because what we said was, on their side of the house, these factors, for example, having a low income level, are things that can be easily faked, or things that can be easily counterfeited. So, for example, if my parents are retired and I have a very large fund in the bank to sponsor my education, I can still be seen as having a low income level. Or the fact that if my parents are businessmen, they're able to rewrite the books and claim that they have a lower income level than they actually do to get me into this scholarship in the first place. It wasn't about faking a disability. It was about being able to abuse policies to get you into that place. On our side of the house, you're unable to run away from your identity, and it means that individuals are given equal access to these scholarships then. But lastly, I want to weigh this whole idea out, because I would posit that it was because I would like to posit that even if the richest do take away the positions at the most elite universities, that it was on our side of the house that the worst off were able to access things like more education at, for example, middle level institutions, because of the fact that now that they are given a quota, they're able to opt into things like more courses that allow them to diversify and that allow them to prosper later on in life. Because I want you to know, the poor white majority is still able to opt into things like lower level universities anyways, to something that was uniquely exclusive to these poor people, or these poor racial minorities that didn't have this privilege in the first place. Because note the comparative on their side of the house, that these scholarships are likely going to be given to the majority just on a basis of numbers. That since there's more white people, you're going to give these scholarships more and more towards them in the first place. Before I move on, I'll take the point.
On OG, we recognize that we plan to help the poorest Malay as well as the poor Indians. On your side, the poor people who are locked out of government incentive will ensure that the benefits of scholarship are only going to incentivize the wealthy, lengthening the gap, but also making sure that the poor communities remain poor. How do you engage with that?
Right. You never give us any incentive as to why the poor Malay person is going to help the poor Indian person, but I'm going to respond to this idea that poor people will help poor people. I'm going to wait out as to why we get it better on our side. So there's two responses to this. The first is that these structural issues are universal to you, meaning no matter whether you're rich or poor, when you go into the workplace or when you go into things like politics, it means that the richest people are unable to escape this structural discrimination that occurs to them. What this means is this is something you're still going to be affected by no matter where you are socioeconomically, and it means that on our side of the house, the richest people have incentives to go against these structural discrimination in the first place. They have incentives to create policy changes that impact those on the lowest rung of the ladder. What it means is on our side, with these people who had more mobility, we're genuinely able to create more change. Comparatively, on your side, you have poor individuals who are coming out of these universities, and sure, they may have ties, but they're still going to be financially unstable. They're still going to be looking for jobs. It means that on your side of the house, is on your side of the house, you still don't have the capacity to create change like you do on ours. But I really want to quickly do with CG, right? This whole idea about populist narratives, and on their side, you can get more training, right? Because I want you to know on our side of the house that these racial and gender like minorities still have incentives to get those same results that they try and claim. That is to say, you want to prove these populist narratives wrong, and you want to show that as a member of your race, you can represent them well, and it means you're going to get those same results. Comparatively, on their side of the house, the training that they want to talk about is still going to be skewed towards the majority. As Alicia tells you, the populist rhetoric exists on both sides equally. On their side of the house, even though you have more training and you have, for example, a higher percentage, you're still going to have these people knocking down all of your attempts to be down all of your attempts to be able to create reform. The point at which you were still a minority. On our side, you had greater critical mass to be able to create this change. The point at which you simply had a larger number. The point wasn't that you had the point was that even this black man standing up inspiring the children meant that you were able to create mobility. You inspired them, the point at which they were able to opt into things like education for all these reasons.
I thank the speaker for that speech and every